Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Annie Dutcher and I'm the Programs Manager with Free to Breathe, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Clinical Trials, What They Are and How Patients May Benefit. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you have a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature which is located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. I want to give a huge thank you to our supporters, Oncogenics, Lilly, and Boehringer Ingelheim, who made today's webinar possible. A special thank you also goes out to our partner, Lung Cancer Alliance. It's an honor to be joined today by our expert presenters, Dr. Antoinette Wozniak of Karmanos Cancer Institute, as well as board member of Free to Breathe, and we're also joined by Anne-Marie Serrato, lung cancer survivor, clinical trial participant, and board member of Lung Cancer Canada. Today after the webinar, hopefully you'll have learned why clinical research is important, what exactly a clinical trial is, common myths and misconceptions about clinical trials, the process of participating in a clinical trial, challenges to patient accrual, personal clinical trial experience from Anne-Marie Serrato, and available resources. Following the presentation, we'll have time for questions. Please direct all of those questions to that chat box located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. We'll address as many questions as possible during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. And now, Dr. Wozniak, I'm going to hand the presentation over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm speaking about something that's very close and dear to my heart, and that is clinical trials and clinical research. So I think, one of the big questions that comes up is, why are we doing clinical research? Well, it's actually a way to prove something works or not. And I have an example up on this particular slide, and I remember this quite well. A number of years ago, we were using bone marrow transplant for breast cancer. And this was a way of giving super high doses of chemotherapy, trying to obliterate the disease, and then giving the bone marrow back to patients. And it's had a lot of side effects, and there was some prolonged hospitalization, and there were a lot of reports that patients were having remarkable responses. And then patients across the country really petitioned their insurance companies to pay for them to have these bone marrow transplants. Finally, a randomized study was done in which half the patients were given the super high doses of chemotherapy with the transplant, and the other half got standard chemotherapy. And when they compared the two groups, there was no difference in outcome. So the cost, and not just money-wise, but if you think about the side effects related to the treatment, were not worth it because it wasn't a better treatment compared to standard treatment. So, this is one example of why we do clinical trials. Okay. Now, where is the research done? Well, for the most part, most of the clinical trials are done in academic medical centers, but some community practices do get involved in clinical trials as well. The support comes from many different sources. It can come from your own institution in the form of philanthropy. There is federal funding available. I am part of an NCI designated cancer center, and we can get federal funding for some trials. There are some specialized programs of excellence where they do some of the basic science research and try to translate that into clinical trials. There's program projects. There are other individual research grants, although these are hard to get, and they're usually not big enough to support clinical trials. But trials are also done from nonprofit foundation support, like Free to Breathe. So what is a clinical trial? Well, it's a research study, and the goal is to find new ways to prevent, diagnose, or treat disease. It doesn't necessarily have to be cancer, although that's what we're talking about here. So a cancer clinical trial actually tests new treatments in people with cancer. And the treatments could include new drugs, combinations of old drugs, new approaches to surgery or radiation therapy, or any type of advance. So it can cover many different aspects of treatment, cancer prevention, and many different types of trials. they're often divided into phase 1 through phase 4 trials, and you may hear this, so I'm going to try to give you an idea of what each phase means. So a phase 1 trial is an early trial. Researchers are testing a new drug or a new treatment in a small group of patients. Sometimes it's more than one type of cancer. But it's the first time they're able to evaluate the safety of a drug, to determine what the dosage might be, and to look at the side effects. And again, these are investigational drugs testing for the first time in human beings. They may also be therapies with older drugs that are combined in a different way. And the goal is safety. However, they are also looking for clues as to see which cancers might respond to treatment, because many of these trials utilize patients with different cancer types. So it is looking for efficacy as well as safety. When you get to phase 2, this trial's focus is actually on safety again. By now, though, after the phase 1 trial was done, you do have a dose to test and a schedule. But usually the phase 2 trials are actually in specific cancer types, like lung cancer or breast cancer. And so the goal of the trial is not only safety, but they're really looking to see if there's an indication that the treatment works. Now let's get to a phase 3 trial. This is generally a larger trial. This is a larger group of patients, and the goal is to confirm whether a treatment works. Of course, we always monitor side effects. And often this is what we call a randomized trial, and we're going to talk about that a little later. But the goal is to compare commonly used drugs and to collect information and to compare it to a new treatment generally. So these are large comparison trials. So the goal is to try to see if a new treatment might be potentially better versus a standard treatment. So it's a large comparative trial. And the next slide, we actually even have phase 4 trials. I don't get involved in these too often, once in a while. These are actually often conducted after a drug or treatment's been approved. And these trials are meant to collect more information about side effects and sometimes what the long-term risks are and how well the drug or treatment works when it's used more widely in different settings, not only academic settings, but also in community practices. And that's often these trials, often community practices will participate in this type of trial. Now, there's a lot of issues with clinical trials, and I think one of the things that I often have problems with is that people have myths and misconceptions right at the beginning. So for instance, I can't tell you how many times I hear this: I don't want to be a guinea pig. I don't want to be experimented on. Well, these trials truly are experiments, but often we do come up with good treatments. In fact, many of the standard treatments that we use now, in fact, all of the standard treatments that we use have gone through a process, the process of clinical trials. So there is maybe a potential advantage to having access to a new treatment by participating in a trial. We actually don't use guinea pigs for research anymore. Another thing that happens is I'm often asked, am I getting a placebo? And this is a common question even when the word placebo is never mentioned. So let's talk a little bit about placebos in clinical trials. So what a placebo is it is an inactive drug or treatment. And it often is referred to as a sugar pill. You probably hear that a lot. Placebos have a role in cancer clinical trials, but only when it's scientifically necessary. And I'm going to give you some examples in a moment. and when it's ethically appropriate. And the patient has to be informed that a placebo may be part of the treatment plan. They have to know this. Now, when might you use a placebo? They are never used if you have already a highly effective or potentially curative therapy available. You will not get a placebo as part of that trial. Okay, so when do we use them? Well, I think the second bullet point is an example of when we use them most frequently. That is, if you have a treatment already, but there's a potential that an additional drug or treatment to what we already know might be better or might not be. So we're talking about an effective treatment, and then patients will get randomized, and again you hear that word randomized, and we'll talk about that momentarily, to an additional treatment or a placebo. But they're getting the effective treatment. It's just whether they're getting an additional treatment to the effective treatment or whether they're getting a placebo. This is really the only way that they really can compare whether the additional treatment to the effective treatment is of any benefit. And when it comes to placebo trials, this is really where we use them the most. Now, placebos can be tested against a new treatment when there's no effective treatment available. So when do we see this happening? Well, if a patient has already received multiple lines of chemotherapy, for instance, and it's really unclear whether another chemotherapy is going to be of any value, they may actually compare it to placebo. I think that those trials still occur. They're less often used, particularly in this country. The bullet point number 2 is more common. Okay, what about affording a clinical trial? Many patients are concerned about some of the costs that might be involved. Well, the Affordable Care Act actually requires health insurance companies to cover routine costs associated with a clinical trial. What do I mean by routine costs? Scans like CAT scans or laboratory tests that would be routinely used to monitor a patient will be covered. Medicare covers routine costs as well. When it comes to Medicaid coverage of clinical trials, that's variable from state to state, so you would have to check within your own state what the potential, if there's any potential problem with covering costs of a trial. Health insurance and companies, however, and Medicare are not required to provide coverage for the cost of a treatment that is being studied or a procedure that's being required to collect data. And let me give you an example. For instance, say a patient is on a trial that requires a new biopsy of the tumor. That might not be covered. So you really have to discuss this with your physician. Now, investigational medications that are part of a clinical trial are generally provided free of charge because they are investigational. It's very, very often that additional testing and procedures, for instance, I gave the example of another biopsy. Some of the new treatments we are evaluating require monitoring with EKGs, which would not be something typically needed if you weren't on a trial. So the companies often actually do pay for these additional testing and procedures, and you have to check with your physician about this. And it's important to talk to the research team to see what might not be covered and what costs you might end up getting as a result of participating. But often, a lot of these are covered. A clinical trial is a patient's last chance. Well, many clinical trials are actually available in the initial treatment setting, so that's not always true. A clinical trial which utilizes a novel treatment actually may be the patient's best chance. So you have to discuss all options again with your physician. Once I agree to participate, am I obligated to stay in the clinical trial? Involvement in a clinical trial is entirely and always voluntary. One may decline to participate at any point in the trial. A patient can even decide not to participate before the trial treatment begins. Say I have a patient who thinks about it, goes home, talks about it with his or her family, decides not to participate. They have every right to withdraw at any point in time. What about the process of participating in the clinical trial? Well, the first thing I think one needs to do is speak to your oncologist about participating in a trial. Often a trial may be offered to you during your initial consultation. Trials aren't always available. It may be wise to seek a second opinion regarding the availability of clinical trials, especially if a trial is not offered and you're truly interested in participating in one. You may have to go to an institution who actually is doing a lot of clinical trials to actually see if there is something available. What is the process? Well, everyone has to sign an informed consent. Informed consent is the process of learning the details of the clinical trial in order to make an educated decision about whether one wants to participate or not. And every patient is asked to sign an informed consent and is given a copy of this consent, or should be given a copy of this consent for the records. What is an informed consent? Well, an informed consent is a document that talks about the purpose of the trial, the procedures that are required for the study, that is scans, biopsies, laboratory tests, the risks and benefits of the trials, your right to leave the study at any time, your right to learn about all your treatment options outside a trial, and your right to learn about all treatments and tests involved in the study. So these documents are actually fairly lengthy. Many trials have documents in different languages. And if someone wants to participate in a trial and is eligible, certainly there's various ways that that we can make sure that the patient participating understands the document and makes an educated decision. What else happens on trials? Well, I mentioned the word randomization, okay? And this is a method that assures that the experimental group and that patients assigned to whatever. Well, let me explain it in a different way. Some trials have what we call different study groups, different arms. They can have 2, 3, 4. It depends upon the size of the study. And what generally these randomized trials are doing are comparing new treatments to a standard approach. And like I said, it can be one treatment being compared or 2 or 3. And at the beginning of the trial, once a patient is deemed to be eligible, there is a procedure similar to a coin flip, and it's usually done by computer, and a treatment is picked for the patient. Okay? And it's done this way so that the types of patients on each study arm are fairly equalized in terms of gender, age, etc., and so that they can make a proper comparison at the end of the trial. Sometimes trials are what we call blinded. Now, blinding actually what it does is it potentially reduces bias on the part of patients, investigators, and patients do not actually then know what treatment they're receiving. They're receiving one or another. Sometimes the investigators don't know, and that's what we call double-blinded, when both the outcomes assessors and the participants don't know which treatment they're receiving. Again, the whole idea, I know it seems like an uncomfortable idea, but the whole idea is to reduce bias. and the investigators assess outcomes without knowing which treatment the patient's receiving, so there is no bias on their part. Now, what happens in these trials, if someone does not have a good outcome, they can be unblinded. So it's not as if there's an urgent issue that patients would remain blinded to treatment, or actually the investigators. So, there are ways of knowing what treatment is being received, particularly if there's a side effect that isn't anticipated. Now, I think this slide is pretty important because these clinical trials that we participate in are highly regulated. Every institution that, or even a practice that is involved in a clinical trial has to put the trial through what's called an institutional review board, or an IRB. And this is an independent committee of experts, doctors, statisticians, advocates, etc., who ensure that the clinical trial is ethical. They review it, they look at the consent form, and they want to make sure that the rights and welfare of the study participants are protected. Every clinical trial has to be approved by an IRB. There are local IRBs. We have 2 of them at our institution, but it can also be approved through what we call a central IRB. Also, particularly larger studies, but all studies have a data safety monitoring board. So again, this is an independent group of health professionals that are not part of the trial, that monitor the trial for safety and scientific relevance throughout the study period. For instance, I've actually been involved in a number of data safety monitoring boards in the past few years, and often the trials that we look at are randomized trials comparing one experimental treatment to another, and we meet at designated time points where we review how the trial is doing in terms of how many patients are on, whether the patients were all eligible. We look at all the side effects. We also look at how the patients are doing, because in the event that the experimental arm is worse than the standard arm, the study can be stopped and would be stopped. But also, if the experimental arm is much better than the standard arm, the study would be stopped in favor of the experimental arm. So this is looked at throughout the trial. Both the FDA and the National Institute of Health are responsible for approving drugs and monitoring research. Now, I've been doing clinical trials for a long time, and sometimes there are a lot of challenges with the patients themselves. It's, again, the misconceptions regarding clinical trials. It's social support. Often trials require a patient to be at the clinic a lot more often, so they need the support from their families or friends to bring them down. And of course we have the insurance difficulties, but I think that many of these can be overcome. The physicians are also a problem. There are many physicians who do not offer trials or even refer patients for a trial. They could do that for a variety of reasons. They may just not want to bother. But also, doing clinical trials does require support staff. And it's hard to conduct them without help. And many physicians, particularly those out in the community, do not have the staff support to conduct clinical trials. But they do generally have a cancer center that's not too far away so that they still can refer for trials. And sometimes the clinical trials are complicated, and the consent forms are complicated, making it somewhat difficult to present the study design to the patient, or it takes a while for the patient to read the consent form and make sure that they do want to participate. And many of my patients, when they offer the trial, they'll say, "Oh, I'll just sign and do it." Well, I don't, that's fine, but I insist that they take it home, read it through, and make sure that they really want to do this. If they don't want to do this right in the office, they can read it through at home, discuss it with their families, and certainly if they want to participate or decide to retract their consent, that's not a problem. Many of the new trials, particularly the ones in lung cancer, need tissue. And I think this is very important because the trials that are being developed we're designing them to target certain abnormalities in the cancer and to try to be more specific about the treatment that is being provided. So some of the trials do require biopsies. And there can be extensive stringent eligibility criteria that makes it difficult. Most of the trials require that someone have normal kidney function, normal liver function, normal white cells, platelets, hemoglobin, etc. And many patients who have been heavily treated may not be eligible for trials because of these stringent eligibility criteria. But patients do benefit from clinical trials, and I have to share the story of a very dear patient. She was 66 years old when she was diagnosed with metastatic adenocarcinoma of the lung in actually 2005. She came to see me mainly because she did not like what her initial oncologist told her with regard to her prognosis. So she participated in the first clinical trial, which was basically chemotherapy plus zoledronic acid, and she had a fairly stable disease. She did all right on it, but after that was done, we put her on a second trial with erlotinib and bevacizumab, and this is again a randomized trial, randomized to get, the other one was, and so is this one, randomized to get bevacizumab, or in this case a placebo along with the erlotinib, but the erlotinib was the active treatment. She did fabulous on this trial and was on erlotinib for 6 or 7 years. The third trial, again a randomized trial, was chemotherapy plus or minus continuing the erlotinib when she showed signs of progression. Again, she did very well on this. Her fourth clinical trial was an investigational agent targeting a new mutation in the cancer, and she went on that. And her last trial was an expanded access trial with another investigational agent. And if she had the opportunity, she would have gone on an additional trial. And I think she benefited a great deal, particularly from trial 2 and 3. And she did very well for a long time. So clearly she had no fear of participating and benefited from these trials. And I think that's my last slide. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wozniak. I'm going to pass over the presentation now to Anne-Marie Serrato, who will share her personal experiences as a clinical trial participant. And just a quick reminder, as you have questions, keep bringing them in. Just put them into that chat box in the left lower hand corner of your screen, and we'll address questions at the end. Thanks.
Well, hi, everyone. My name is Anne-Marie Serrato. I am a patient, and I've been so since 2009. When I was originally diagnosed in 2009, I was stage 3A, so I received chemo, radiation, and surgery followed by additional chemo. And I was successful for about a year until about 2011 when I had a recurrence. And unfortunately, the disease moved from one side of my lung to the other and multiple lobes, which at that time presented a bit of a complication because I had already received radiation and surgery. So I was ineligible for additional radiation and surgery just due to the way the cancer had spread. So I expected the natural progression of things would be to go into chemo, but at the time I was told that because I was asymptomatic, and I had been from the beginning, that I would have to wait for chemotherapy. For me, as a young person, I was originally diagnosed at the age of 30. I didn't really find it acceptable and had a really hard time not being able to actually do anything and being told to wait. I knew that if I waited until the disease was, or I was symptomatic from the disease, that chances were it would be too late for me to make a recovery or enter into remission. So I really tried to find any tangible source of treatment that was out there. I was looking in Europe, and I happened to come across an article that was posted online, ironically, one day, and it was talking about New Hope for lung cancer patients. And it was talking about a drug that was in a late phase trial that was giving patients months and sometimes years. And it really piqued my curiosity because I'd never really considered a clinical trial. I actually didn't even really know they existed or to what extent they existed. And so I quickly, after reading the article, emailed my nurse navigator and said, hey, what is this, what is this drug I want on? And didn't really know anything about mutations, clinical trials, any of it, but I just knew that it was an option for me where I really didn't have any viable options. So she and my oncologist referred me to a trial that was happening just outside of my city, and now I'm in Toronto, Ontario, so it was just outside of Toronto, and I met with the oncologist who was participating in the trial, and he explained to me that my tumor would be sent to Cleveland at the time to be tested for the ALK mutation, which is one of the more prominent mutations in non-small cell lung cancer. We found out that I was indeed ALK positive, and from there I was randomized, and fortunately I was able to receive the active drug right on the onset. This particular trial was interesting in that if I had been randomized into the chemotherapy that they were testing against the drug, which was Xalkori, if I progressed, that I would eventually get the Xalkori anyway. And so for me, I didn't have any qualms about participating because it just gave me something that I could do and something that was, hopeful for me. So I began on the Xalkori in September of 2011, and within 6 weeks, I had already showed regression in the tumors, and some of them had actually disappeared. And then the following set of scans actually showed that my lungs were clear. So for me, this was amazing, and I'm very happy to say that ever since that time, I've received positive results, and that I've remained NED for almost 3.5 years. So for me, it's given me 3 years that I probably wouldn't have gotten if I didn't ever reach out and ask about a clinical trial. So for me, it's really been a godsend. I typically will see my oncologist every 3 weeks. Now things may differ between Canada and the US. I've never had to pay for anything. All of my scans have been included, and it's a fairly rigorous screening that you go through on this particular trial. I have a CAT scan, a chest CAT scan every 6 weeks. I have a pelvic and brain scan every 12 weeks, and bone scan every 12 weeks, as well as an echo. In a sense, on one hand, it's a lot of testing, but on the other hand, for me, it always allows me to have my results and know that if I do progress at any point while I'm on the study, that I'm being monitored very closely and that intervention can probably occur very quickly. The benefit for me was not just having the freedom to not have to go to the hospital every day, having an intravenous chemo. I take an oral therapy, so I'm allowed to really live a very normal life with very sort of little medical intervention necessary. I have a really great relationship with my oncologist. I'm able to ask him questions. I see him every 3 weeks, so if anything does come up, I'm able to address any concerns I have fairly quickly. As well, the nurse that's associated with the trial will call and update me with results if I didn't get them at my last appointment, or will call me with any irregularities or any potential drug interactions if I do happen to go on a new prescription. Some of the downsides to a clinical trial is that because the drugs are fairly new, that some side effects aren't often known or well known, and sometimes you will encounter things. In my experience, they haven't been detrimental. It's things like stomach upset, diarrhea, vomiting, and for the most part, I've been able to control that with my diet, as well sometimes edema, which I can control with a diuretic. So really, it's things that are minute in comparison to the symptoms you may receive on an intravenous chemotherapy, or even with the disease itself. So I mean, I'm really blessed that I found the clinical trial, and I would 100%, go register for another one should things progress. So, I mean, for me as a patient, I think being really proactive about my treatment options is something that I would suggest every patient do. You know, there are numerous resources via the web that are very reliable that, you know, are talking about current trials within lung cancer, whether it's EGFR, ALK mutations, ROS1 mutations, even the PDI trials that are immunotherapy based. You know, there's some information that is in, you know, regular people talk, not jargon, and you get a perspective from people that are actually on the trials, what they're going through. I think that's really important as well, because sometimes when you're on a trial and you don't know anyone else that's on the trial for that particular drug, you don't really know if what you're feeling is normal. And so connection, I think, is very important, and there are some communities. I'm hoping Annie will mention them, but I know Cancer Grace is one, and I believe Inspire, Team Inspire is another that have, you know, online communities that people can talk and share their knowledge. But as a patient, really being an advocate for yourself is really something that I would advocate to others, and I know has benefited me in particular. So I can't really say enough about them. It wasn't necessarily that it was my only hope, but it definitely presented me with hope, and I'm here to talk about it. And so I welcome any questions anyone may have, but that is probably all I really have to say about the experience.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. If you have questions for Anne-Marie or for Dr. Wozniak, please continue to put them in that chat box in the left-hand corner of your screen. I'm going to talk very briefly about some resources that Free to Breathe would like to share with you, and then we'll move into the Q&A time. First of all, a really wonderful resource related to clinical trials is the Emerging Med Matching Service, Clinical Trials Matching Service. And this is a service where all you need to do is call the number listed below, 1-877-601-8601, and you'll be in touch with a clinical trials navigator. This person will talk through your own unique histology and your diagnosis, and they'll be able to let you know if there are clinical trials available to you. It would save you a lot of time compared to hand searching through NCI's website or other websites trying to sort through all the clinical trial options. This is a really wonderful free resource, and they do have folks who can speak to you in English or Spanish. Additionally, Free to Breathe offers some free print resources. For example, we do have a clinical trials flyer that you can order. All of our resources, including this flyer, are free and can be ordered from our website or viewed online. So please check that out, and the URL is listed in this slide at freetobreathe.org/resources. We also have just general content about clinical trials. If you want to learn more about what clinical trials are, the potential benefits, you can visit our website, freetobreathe.org/clinicaltrials. Anne-Marie mentioned several really wonderful support networks online, and certainly there are many. She mentioned Inspire. There's a few other opportunities that we want to address here today. One is the Cancer Hope Network. They provide free and confidential emotional support to patients, caregivers, and family members. But their program that I'm really excited about, and that's actually related to clinical trials, is they're talking about clinical trials program. So they'll actually match you. If you're considering a clinical trial, they'll match you to someone who has already participated in a clinical trial and can share their personal experience. So kind of like having an Anne-Marie, but at your disposal on the phone whenever you want. Lung Cancer Alliance also has a call-in line. If you have any questions about lung cancer, they can help refer you to the right place. Additionally, they have a phone buddy program and an online support community for those who've been impacted by lung cancer. For your financial questions, or if you have questions about your legal rights as a cancer survivor, you can visit the Patient Advocate Foundation. They're a wonderful organization, and if they can't help you, they will refer you to someone who can help you. And finally, I think something that's a little bit of a lesser known resource is Angel Flight. I actually learned about this from a volunteer who worked closely with our organization. She was going to a clinical trial many thousands of miles away and was traveling free through Angel Flight. And they offer free air transportation for some folks who have financial concerns but need to access medical care out of state. I want to again just thank our very generous sponsors, Oncogenics, Lilly Beringer Ingelheim, and our partner as well, Lung Cancer Alliance. I just want you to note that in the next few days we'll be sending a follow-up email with a link to view or share the recording of today's webinar. You can watch it again or share it with your friends. And now we'll move into a time of questions. As I mentioned earlier, please feel free to continue sending your questions as they come. We'll do our best to address as many of them as possible. And I'm going to start with the first question, and this one is for Dr. Wozniak. Dr. Wozniak, can you just confirm, one person is asking, so with clinical trial participation, there could potentially be cost involved for the patient.
Right. There could potentially, and the research team should know what might be a potential issue. But I have to say that in terms of most of the costs are really sort of standard of care, like the scans, like the laboratory tests. And the sponsor for the trial will usually pay for any additional testing that needs to be done. I'll give you an example. And many of the new drugs we are testing require frequent EKGs, which would not be something typically done as part of a standard treatment. However, companies will actually provide the EKG machine and the interpretation and pay for the cost. So a lot of these things are really covered either by the trial itself or your standard insurance. But I think it's still important to ask that question and make sure that you don't get any hidden costs.
Great, thank you. And another question for Dr. Wozniak. Are there, to your knowledge, any current clinical trials for people with small cell lung cancer after standard protocol of chemo or radiation?
Okay, so there are. Okay, small cell lung cancer, I go back a little ways, okay, was always a very fertile area for trials. And what happened in the last few years, there hasn't been a lot of progress in many, many years. We've been trying, but it seems like it's been difficult finding new innovative treatments for small cell. So we currently have a trial actually that's what's called a second-line trial, meaning these are patients who relapse with the disease within 6 months of finishing their initial treatment. And it is a standard chemotherapy plus a new drug that is one of these targeted agents that is going after a target that we hope will be a good target for small cell. So there are a number of institutions that do have trials. You have to really, actually looking online at clinicaltrials.gov, clinicaltrials.gov, G-O-V, will probably, doing a search there might give you some idea of the trials that are available in small cell.
Great, thank you. And I also wanted to remind folks that the Emerging Med Clinical Trials Matching Service would also be able to identify any specific clinical trials, whether it's for small cell lung cancer or for folks with specific mutations as well, so something to keep in mind. This is a question for Anne-Marie. Someone was just hoping you could clarify your specific lung cancer diagnosis.
Sure. I was diagnosed with adenocarcinoma, and then when I recurred, it was discovered that it was adenocarcinoma in situ. And I also have an ALK-positive mutation.
Thank you. Another question for Dr. Wozniak. For somebody who might already be in treatment, can they still be considered for a clinical trial?
So I get a lot of patients who come to me for opinions regarding their treatment, and some of them have already started. Generally, if I feel that it's a good treatment, I usually tell them to continue with it to see how they do, because some of the standard approaches are also good treatments. So generally, if you're in the midst of the treatment, if you're benefiting, it wouldn't be at that point a good idea to change. However, I do tell patients that in the event that they get a progression of their disease later, or if the treatment does not work for them, then I would be happy to discuss a clinical trial at that time.
Great. One more question for Dr. Wozniak. Do you have to go to a major cancer center to participate in a clinical trial?
Not always. Many clinical practices do participate in trials. Some of the more unique drugs, either in the phase 1 or phase 2 setting, generally you do have to go to a cancer center. That's where the trials are usually being done. So, and I think, it's interesting. We have a lot of trials, and patients will come to me, and I will be very honest with them in terms of whether I feel that this is a trial that is worth the effort in terms of travel and time. And many trials are. Some trials may not be. They're good trials, but whether you should drive or travel 300 miles for it is another issue. But some of the more unique drugs, like the ALK positive patients, there are some new ALK inhibitors, and these are going to be tested really in only clinical cancer large centers, and those are definitely worth traveling for. So it really depends upon the situation.
Great, thank you. One other question, and just a reminder, we don't have any current pending questions, so we'll give you just another minute or two to put those questions in. But one other question for Dr. Wozniak. If a patient is talking with their physician, they've just been diagnosed and they're not offered a clinical trial, but they wish they would have been, what would you recommend that they do?
Well, I think that is where you go to and you can probably use one of these like I think Emerging Med, will they tell you about centers close by?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, okay. So I think it's worthwhile going to one of these centers and finding out what's available and seeing a physician there. Again, I'm very honest with the patient. If I feel that this is a fabulous new drug that that we have high hopes for, and it's worth the travel, if there's some travel involved, I will tell them that. If I feel that the trial, that the standard of care being offered to a patient by their local oncologist is a good way to go, I will also be very honest about that. But I think that you have to, if your physicians out in the community often don't offer them because they are not participating. And I think to see what all your options are, it's a good idea to get an opinion from someone who potentially might have a trial for you.
Great, thank you. Another question for Dr. Wozniak. Do you have any thoughts about why there aren't a lot of drugs for squamous cell lung cancer?
Oh, well, that's again like a little bit like small cell. We've sort of lagged behind a bit. And one of the reasons is we have to identify targets in squamous. So that is happening. There's actually a new, very big national trial called the MAPS trial that is looking at trying to identify targets in squamous cell cancer. These are treatments as second-line treatment, not at the initial presentation, but subsequently after initial treatment no longer benefits a patient. This trial is widely available across the country. And they are, again, it involves examining tissue and, trying to identify targets. So, so we're not forgetting about squamous cell, and I think that the interest in trying to find a target is really, there's a lot of interest lately, and this trial is, an example of that.
Great, thank you. One final question for both of you, if you could answer this. If you could sum up in just a sentence or two why you think someone should consider a clinical trial, what would you say? Dr. Wozniak, do you want to start?
Oh, okay. I think it's an opportunity to hopefully get a new and better treatment. I think that. Well, I can't sum it up in one sentence, but I think it's an opportunity to try new and better treatment. That's why, and hopefully that the patient gains some benefit from it. Often they do.
And Anne-Marie, what are your thoughts?
Well, I have so many. I would echo Dr. Wozniak's statement in that it is a very good opportunity to take sometimes with the most cutting edge treatment available. For me, it was a matter of finding hope in a situation that wasn't very hopeful. I didn't know what the benefits would be going in, and I've experienced so many, and so I really do look at them as an opportunity for patients to explore other options.
Great, thank you. And it looks like another question just came in. Dr. Wozniak, in small cell lung cancer, if you do know the answer to this, in second-line treatment, it would be standard chemo plus a new drug. Do you know the name of that drug?
It's an aurora kinase inhibitor, and it has a number. It does not have a name. Okay. A lot of the drugs that are early on in development will just have a number. They won't have a name, number and maybe a few letters. But it's a target that they have identified that might be potential. It's a potential target. It's the problem with small cells, identifying, again, actionable targets. There's been a number of trials with many different drugs, but no advances have been made. So I think in the second-line setting, an option for a new drug is really important in this disease.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation today. And then especially a huge thank you to Dr. Wozniak and Anne Marie for your very informative session. Just want to encourage you all to please take a moment to complete a survey about this webinar. It will appear in your browser after we close the webinar. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.